After Peter had confessed his faith that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God, Jesus told him, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Peter, whose own name meant rock, was familiar as a fisherman with the rocks that resist the restless sea. He was also familiar with the ancient rocks used as the foundation for the great Temple of Jerusalem. But what did Jesus mean by this rock on which he would build his church? I've had many a conversation about this. In the early church, the work of Peter and the other apostles, based on the faith that they lived and the faith that they preached, that created the church. The church was built upon their labours, their labour of love, their labour of faith. It was built upon their work of preaching the gospel. So those apostles and prophets of the New Testament period of the early church, they laid the foundation. So it was the people like Peter who were the foundation of the church, but only insofar as they lived out the Christian life and performed the Great Commission to preach the gospel of Christ. So I think it's really a bit of a strange sort of argument to be separating Peter from Peter's faith. The important point is, firstly, that Jesus said, "I will build my church." It wasn't going to be Peter's church. It was going to be the Church of Christ. And we still call it the Church of Christ today. We don't call it the Church of St. Peter. Well, some churches, of course, are called the Church of St. Peter. Some local congregations in, say, the Anglican or the Roman Catholic Church, but we all call the church, the real church, not the building or some local congregation, but we call the Church of Christ. The churches that I belong to call the local congregations churches of Christ too. They believe we shouldn't be naming churches after people like Peter or Bartholomew or Mary or whatever. But we do believe that the apostles and the prophets, in the faith that they preach, the gospel that they preach, laid a foundation for the church. But Jesus Christ, he's the main part of the foundation, not Peter or any other apostle or person, only Christ. He's the, as it says in Ephesians, in Ephesians chapter 2, that he's the chief cornerstone. If you want to know what the foundation of the church is, you don't have to argue about what Jesus said to Peter. You don't have to argue about that. All these arguments about what the rock meant or whether the faith was the foundation, all of these arguments to me are irrelevant. Ephesians chapter 2 gives us exactly what the foundation of the church is, and that ties in perfectly with what Jesus said to Peter. And it emphasises the really important part of Christ's statement, "I will build my church." In Ephesians 2 verse 20, it says that God's household, which is another name for his church, is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. So the church was built on Peter. Peter was the rock on which the church was built, but not just Peter. It says here, the apostles and prophets. Peter was one of the apostles. But there were other apostles, and there were also prophets in the New Testament period, and they all, in their ministries, laid the foundation of the church. So it wasn't just Peter, it was all of them. But look at this, it says, Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone, and in him, in Jesus, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. Now Christ is the centre of the foundation. He's the chief cornerstone. And so when he said, "On this rock I will build my church," he was pointing out that Peter was going to be part of that rock, that foundation, but only a part of it. And all the other apostles were going to be part of the foundation, but Jesus himself was going to be the important part, see? That's what it's all about. Jesus says, "I will build my church." That's what it's all about. It's the church of Christ. Not Peter's church or the apostles' church, the church of Christ. That's what concerns me, that today in the religious world people seem to be building churches on all sorts of foundations and giving them, if not the names of some apostle like Peter, giving them the names of various men or the doctrines that these men or women teach, when really the only true church is the church that Jesus built. Put it this way, if a church hasn't been built yet, then it isn't the one that Jesus built. Because he said, I will build my church, and he didn't say he was going to build it in the year 2000 or something. He was obviously going to build it after he died and rose from the dead. And the apostles and the prophets of the New Testament, in their ministry, they are the ones that built the church. So any church that wasn't built, and I'm not talking about buildings, brick and mortar buildings or stone cathedrals or anything, I'm talking about the people church, the spiritual church, the church made up of the saints or the saved, right? Now, if somebody starts a church, okay, they start a church like many of the denominations that have been started, like a couple of centuries ago, all sorts of churches like the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses and so on, they were started. Before that, Protestant churches all got started, your Lutherans, your Anglicans and so on, and there were other kinds of Protestant churches like your Methodists and so on, and then before that there were the great schisms in the Orthodox Church, the Roman schism, the Eastern schism and so on. So you've got all various Orthodox churches now. You've got all various Protestant churches, you've got all kinds of latter-day movements, you've got every kind of church you can imagine. The problem I see is Jesus said, I will build my church. I don't know which one of these churches he built, because they all started too late, didn't they? The church I want to belong to, the church that bothers me, is the one that Jesus built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, and he was the chief cornerstone. That's a church I want to belong to, and I think that's possible.